Our epistle lesson assigned for this Pentecost day is from Romans 8, verses 22 through 27. The Apostle Paul writes, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly, while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God." I can tell you from experience that indeed it does hurt to give birth. One thing I remember from the birth of my son is asking the nurses for help, and when they asked what I wanted them to do to help me, their question bewildered me. What did I want? I had had a specific thing in mind when I asked, but when they asked me, all I could say was, "I don't know." My pain had completely short-circuited my decision-making and even my own awareness of what I wanted. That's how much it hurts to give birth. And you know this even if you have never given birth to a child, because all of us are giving birth to something new every day. We've grown from childhood through puberty, that was painful, and on into adulthood. Also, we may have married, we may have remarried, we've probably moved households, we've changed jobs, we've possibly experienced serious illness. We've definitely said goodbye to loved ones. Throughout our lives, things may feel pretty stable, even for years at a time, but change is always happening below the surface, and all change involves some level of suffering. It hurts to give birth to something new. What gets us through suffering? Hope. But according to Paul, hope is not sitting around waiting for God to effect the ideal solution that we have already conceived for our problem. Instead, hope is waiting for some great good that God will provide, so surprising that we could never have thought of it. What God has in mind is never the limited thing that we humans picture, but something unseeable, unthinkable, unimaginable. And for that, we have to wait with patience in the midst of our suffering. In his letter to the Romans, Paul's discourse on suffering and hope lies at the center of his most difficult and personal issue. What does the coming of Christ mean for Paul's people, the Jews, within the history of God's work in the world? Christ's first followers were Jews, but the Spirit-filled church created on Pentecost would go on to include non-Jews, Gentiles, as well. Some Jews argued that such a change to the church was unacceptable. Paul had to wrestle with those arguments, which involved wrestling with his own faith, a faith to which he had devoted his life, a faith that had defined his identity. No wonder Paul's astounding and masterful and radical letter to the Romans includes an extended discussion of change and suffering. No wonder he reaches for hope. No wonder he celebrates patience. No wonder he counsels waiting for what cannot be seen or even imagined. Paul himself had been radically changed on the road to Damascus by an encounter with the risen Christ. He certainly had not seen that coming. Paul held forth hope as an antidote for suffering. The suffering of creation as it waits for the return of Christ. The suffering of individuals as they wait for their bodies to be redeemed in Christ. The suffering of the church as it struggles with conflict and change. Hope is the antidote. But hope is not our picturing the perfect solution and then asking God to make it happen. Hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, something we cannot imagine, something that is far superior to any solutions we can conceive on our own, we wait for it with patience. What sustained Paul in his patient waiting? What sustains us in our patient waiting? Prayer, surely. Fellowship, definitely. The love of fellow believers, absolutely. Paul mentions these over and over in his letters. And also, he mentions a spiritual meal, shared by the people in whom the Spirit lives, the same Spirit who intercedes for believers when their pain is so great that they don't even know what to ask for. The spiritual meal of bread and wine as Christ's body and blood. Coming together for this sacramental meal, recognizing that what binds them together is their faith in Jesus Christ, has held Christians together even in their most challenging times. A little Moravian history is appropriate here. It is generally believed that the first Moravian settlement in America, the Savannah settlement of 1735, failed partially because of conflict among its members. And in 1739, when Moravian leader Peter Baylor visited Savannah, he was distressed to learn that the members of the settlement had not celebrated communion for more than a year. He didn't know much about their conflict. They didn't tell him a lot about their conflict. But he knew that in failing to gather at the Lord's table, the members of the Georgia settlement had deprived themselves of sustenance for their community. They were trying to give birth to a new thing, but in the pain of their conflict, they seemed to have forgotten what they wanted and needed. Pain has a way of short-circuiting our decision-making. What gets us through pain, what gets us through suffering, what sustains us throughout all the changes of our lives and holds us together as a community is hope. And what nourishes us in our hope is this sacramental meal. Let us partake, and let us be grateful, and let us live in hope for what we cannot imagine.